George Bull. He's head of tax at Baker Tilly Financial. Thank you so much for coming on the show, George. In terms of what we're hearing, it seems that we have a few CEOs, a few very rich businessmen saying, well, I want to pay more tax, but it seems that for the government it's still going to be a very difficult equation, because if you tax the rich too much, then you risk a flight of capital.
There are three factors, I think, operating here. One is a very old principle, which we recognise in the recent CEO statements, that of those to whom much is given, much is expected. And I think a lot of people are genuinely waking up saying, hang on these very high earnings levels that we enjoy, what ought we to be paying back to society? Then, of course, we've got the cuts coming through, and they're going to hit the low and middle income groups hardest. And then, of course, responsible taxation. Governments need to be accountable for how they spend people's taxes.
George, do you really think that there's a kind of collective conscience from the world's rich in saying, I want to do my bit more? Because they can also take that money and put it directly into I guess, a government fund or stimulate the economy in other ways. And so what happened to the old adage, there's always time to die and to pay taxes?
Yeah. I don't think there is a collective conscience working here at all. I think the arguments are mapping out pretty clearly, but I think the few people who are outspoken on this at the moment probably don't represent the majority view, and that's a hard fact for tax authorities to face up to.
And also, I guess they also get shareholders on their side who maybe in the past have seen these guys from rich, avid, greedy men to the guys that want to give something back to society. But how feasible is it for a government to decide to increase taxes for the rich without risking, again, this flight to other havens? Bankers, if you put taxes up too much here in London, will go elsewhere.
I think the maxim for governments here is always to have a plan B. What's plan A? Plan A is to increase income taxes. Now, what is acceptable depends on the jurisdiction. There's something called the Laffer curve, which says there's an optimum point, the highest tax rate at which you maximise the tax yield. You go either side off the curve, the tax yield reduces.
And that is, do you have a figure for that?
Now this is where the really interesting point comes out. On average, the figure is about 65%. But if you go to Sweden, work there says the rate could be as high as 70 or maybe a little bit higher than 70%.
But you get much more benefits on the other side.
Absolutely.
So it's all outweighed.
Correct. You go to the US, and when you start talking of tax rates of 45 or 50%, people start to turn distinctly pale. So it's all relative to the society. But there is a plan A, although if you look at the UK government, they're beginning to wonder whether the 50% tax rate was worth bothering with anyway. So if you like, that's plan A. Plan B, you've talked about the flight of capital. I think that's one of the reasons why we see tax authorities beginning to think about more taxation of land, because whereas you can move cash abroad, you can't move land abroad. So we've got the UK government having a couple of plans at the moment as to how it might tax land more heavily.
Because, of course, in Italy, that solidarity tax at 5% above anyone who had more than 90,000 backfired. Also because they just gave amnesty for a lot of the cash to be repatriated a couple of years ago. So, again, if we look at the whole of Europe, does there seem to be one country that is doing better than the others? At least, the problem with Italy is that they're not even enforcing the tax collection at the moment as much as they could.
Sure. Mr. Sarkozy has promised an extra 3% for the top income groups. They seem to be making something of the commitment that we heard expressed in the Financial Times earlier in the week. But at the moment, to be honest, a lot of people are talking about it, but not many fiscal authorities are really preparing to take any action on the discussions that are going on.
George, tell me, your customers, your clients, have they asked you how can they pay more taxes or how can they pay less tax?
I think the overwhelming majority of questions we get is how can we pay less tax?
Also for the rich.
Sure.
All right, George, thank you so much. George Bull there.